Hello my friends, welcome to The Big Picture. It's wonderful to have you joining us again at the Living Ministry Media Studios for week 5 of our Sabbath School Bible Study Ministry Development Series. This week, we aim to take you on a journey deep into the core issues of the week's Bible study. We want you to be able to present the key issues of the week's study in an uncomplicated way. We want to enable your presentation of the weekly Bible study at your church to be both relevant to the times and biblically authentic. Each week, we will have discussion starters that you can use in the Bible study group at your church. I'm Pastor Gary, mentor and chaplain to the Living Ministry Media team. This week, we move right into Daniel chapter 4 and uncover the remarkable story of the conversion of a pagan king. We call it a person's testimony. In simple terms, a testimony is a story of how a person came to accept the God of heaven. Sometimes, like the Apostle Paul, a person's conversion occurs in a blinding flash, with an individual being knocked off their horse and eternal changes occurring in an instant. In my own case, however, my conversion was part of a process. God worked on my heart over many years, convicting me by His Spirit, leading me to Christ. Over time, He's been changing my thinking patterns and even my life goals. Most biblical Christians can relate to that process. The 4th chapter of Daniel is unique because it does not appear to have been written by Daniel. Rather, it appears to have been written by Nebuchadnezzar as a statement that details his conversion. It's been inserted by Daniel into his book. This, of course, presents us with a question. Why would Daniel place the letter of a heathen king in his book? The answer is actually quite simple. Can you imagine if your national leader was to accept Christ and become a Seventh-day Adventist? Can you imagine how you would feel if he was to write his testimony and publish it? Can you imagine the impact that this would have on multitudes? This is what Nebuchadnezzar appears to have done. Daniel has then inserted the document into the book that bears his name. If you like, Daniel 4 is King Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. Understanding this background is key to understanding the events of Daniel chapter 4. But as with most of us, Nebuchadnezzar's conversion was part of a process. You see, like so many of our own conversion stories, God started acting in Nebuchadnezzar's life many years before his eventual conversion. If you're leading this week's discussion of the week's Bible study, why not ask this question? How would you describe the process of your own conversion? Was it a process over many years, or were you knocked off your horse, as was the Apostle Paul? Was there a significant event in your own conversion process? In the case of King Nebuchadnezzar, God interposed into his life numerous times before the events of chapter 4. In chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar is introduced to people who are servants of the Most High God. At this time, there's no particular impact on his faith. Daniel and his 3 friends are just top-ranking candidates from the University of Babylon who are part of a captive nation. In chapter 2, we saw a great image presented in a dream to the king. It's then presented to the prophet himself. After the interpretation, at the very end of the vision, the king makes a profound statement about the God of heaven. Listen to what he says. He says, "The king answered Daniel and said, 'Truly, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, the revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret.'" At the end of chapter 2, the king is impressed with the God of heaven. But here's the rider. The God of heaven is still your God. This is Daniel's God. The king is a polytheist. He worships many gods. He may even have been willing to add a plaque to Daniel's God in his temple. The fact remains, Daniel's God still remains Daniel's God. In chapter 3, the king has watched in absolute awe as fire refuses to consume Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. Then comes his concluding statement. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. Therefore I make a decree that any people or nation or language that speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego shall be cut in pieces. Their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God that can deliver like this." What a statement! What a decree! Just consider what Nebuchadnezzar has acknowledged in this decree. He says the God of heaven is worthy of respect and honour. He even goes on to say no other God can do what the God of heaven can do. Significantly, however, while he gave the God of heaven honour and preferential status, he still did not acknowledge him as his God. All this changes in chapter 4. In Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar writes his testimony, and listen to how he concludes. This is what he says. "At the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honoured him who lives forever and ever, for his kingdom is from generation to generation. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honour the God of heaven, above whose works are truth, whose ways are justice." I don't know about you, but to me, it seems that Nebuchadnezzar is worshipping the God of heaven. With this in mind, if you are presenting the Bible study at your church this Sabbath, why not have your group discuss these questions? Maybe you could ask this: would you agree that Nebuchadnezzar appears to be speaking as one who has been genuinely converted? Does it seem strange to you that God would work for the conversion of the despotic Gentile ruler who had destroyed Solomon's temple? Can you think of other Old Testament examples of where God worked for the salvation of those outside the Jewish nation? This last question is really important. So many contemporary Christians see the God of the Old Testament as a demanding, vengeful tyrant. On one occasion, I recall speaking about the God of the Old Testament. After the presentation, I was approached and a man said to me, "Frankly, Gary, I've never liked the God of the Old Testament. Jesus I like, but I really struggle with the God of the Old Testament." That man was a church elder. As you conclude leading this week's Bible study, you may want to ask this: what does the story of Nebuchadnezzar's conversion say about what the God of the Old Testament is really like? This story presents us with a wonderful view of the Old Testament God. Here is the compassionate God who cared for Daniel, also caring for his persecutor. Here is the Old Testament God working for the salvation of those outside the boundaries of Israel. This is a God that I can love. Well, my friends, that's it for this week. Thank you again for joining us. May the Lord richly bless you as you teach from the book of Daniel this Sabbath. You're dealing with scriptural treasure. This is an absolute goldmine. I'm Pastor Gary Hodgkin. Really look forward to meeting with you next week.